Hello, my name is Ashley. Um, I'm a lot. Um, I am a victim of child sexual assault. I am a teen mother, or no, I was a teen mother. I'm no longer a teenager. Um, I am a member of the LGBTQ community. I am a mother, like I said, a daughter, a sister, a wife, a college student. And currently, I am also a human rights activist and advocate. My journey starts like a lot of kids, most women, most people that are part of the LGBTQ community. I have been the victim of sexual assault. I have been the victim of sexual harassment. I have been so many things. But currently, I am a survivor and a fighter. My story starts, for the most part, as a teenager. Um, Both of my parents were raised in the Amish community, so very conservative, very Christian. And even after they left, um, our lives were centered around Christ and God, and religion, and the church. And up until the age of 21, 22, I was also a very stout Christian. At the age of 16, I became pregnant. And I became pregnant because I was afraid to talk to my parents about the fact that I was sexually active, the fact that I was in love with my boyfriend at the time, and I did not seek birth control. I didn't seek help. So it took about 6 months. So 6 months after I became sexually active, I was pregnant. The thing that struck me the most when I got the confirmation was that at 16, I didn't even know if I wanted to be a mother. I didn't know if I wanted children. Obviously, I was a sophomore in high school. Who who thinks about that as a young person? But I was never given the choice. The moment my pregnancy test came back positive, it was, you will have this child, you will raise this child. And not that my parents weren't hurt and saddened, but never lacked support in that area of my life. But there's a stigma. There's a stigma around a teen being pregnant. And the fact that that stigma hit so hard didn't hit me until I was probably in my 20s. I can remember the first day of my junior year of high school. I didn't go back to the high school. Um, I had been enrolled in the adult education center that was attached to my public school system because they had free daycare for students, and they catered to troubled teens and teen moms and pregnant teenagers. And I remember running into one of my best friends at the time. Her and I had grown up together. And she asked me why I wasn't in school that day because she had missed me on the first day of school. And I was too embarrassed to tell her that at the time I was 3 months pregnant and I wasn't going to be coming back to school. I told her I was sick. I wasn't feeling well, so I missed the first day of school, which I don't actually know if she believed because I never got sick. I never missed school. I actually can't remember up until that point the last time I had skipped a day of school. I wanted to be the golden child. I wanted to be the good one. But instead, I was the black sheep, the one that made the mistake, and I couldn't face it. So my boyfriend and I both um, ended up going to the adult ed center together. And it was a time of shame. It was a long time of shame. I didn't tell almost any of my friends. The only people who knew were the girls and other boys that went to school with me at the adult ed center. And when most people found out that I was pregnant, they were very surprised. I was the quiet one. I was the good girl. I was the young little conservative Christian. I hadn't had my first kiss till I was a freshman in high school. I didn't have my first boyfriend until the same year. And everyone that knew me didn't believe me at first. I was the last person. I was active in my church. I was my youth group leaders at the time were some of my best friends. So when I did become pregnant, my dad didn't talk to me for a week. My mom cried probably every day for the first few days. And like I had always done, I shoved all of my feelings down and just kind of kept going. I mean, you have to, right? You have to just keep going. And so I attended school and I just kept going. There's nothing I could do about it. I didn't have a choice. There was no thought of maybe I'm not ready. Maybe I get an abortion. Or maybe I give this baby up for adoption. That wasn't a choice I got to make. That was a decision made for me. And I don't fault the adults in my life for that, for the most part. They were doing what they thought was right. They were doing what they grew up not thinking was right. But the older I got, the more I realized that this wasn't my decision. This wasn't a decision I made. This wasn't a choice I ever got to have. And up until that point, for so long, I had been seeking approval from boys, from men, approval, adoration, love, something wholesome, something that wasn't dirty, because that's how I felt for a very long time. I never had my innocence, and so I never felt innocent. And so as a teenager, after I had my son, he was the light of my life. It was because of him that I found the strength to graduate high school on time. But it was also because of him that I decided to forego higher education at the time because, well, I have a child to raise and I have to make money. I have to live. He has to have a roof over his head and food in his stomach and everything else a baby needs. So when I graduated high school, he was about a year old. And he was sitting in the crowd with my parents. And he watched me walk down that graduation line. And he's in all of my pictures. And I look back on that time and I think, what would my life have been if there wasn't a baby sitting in that audience? What would I have decided to do? But I can't answer that question because I can't know. And through all of this, I was still an active Christian. I was still actively involved in my church, but some things had changed. By the time I was pregnant and it was announced to my pastor, my youth group leaders had changed. And my boyfriend and I at the time were made to stand in front of teenagers that I had known since I was 8 years old, for the most part, and tell them that we were sinners. Tell them that we had made a mistake and tell them that we were pregnant. From this point on, anything we did together as a couple in the church was under heavy surveillance and scrutinized. At 16, I couldn't hold my boyfriend's hand without somebody saying something. Or at one point, someone coming up to me and physically pulling our hands apart because now I was pregnant. And any show of public affection was no go. And after I had our son, we were asked to leave the youth group, even though we were both still just 17. 3 months later, we got married because we weren't kids anymore. And because I didn't want to have to do it by myself. I had my parents, I was living with my parents, and they were great help, but I wanted my partner. I wanted the father of my child with me. And against most advice, we ended up getting married. And as you can imagine, 17 years old, marriage isn't great. It's not the best step to take. And it didn't last. So by the time I was 18, right before I turned 19, we had finalized our divorce and he had moved on. And I was a single mother. And this is a part of a story that most people probably aren't aware of. is that when teen moms don't get a chance to process what they're going through, when life throws everything at them, when mental health help isn't readily available, when you are caged in on all sides by the morals and values you were raised with, and you feel helpless and you don't get to be a kid, eventually something will probably trigger. And it triggered. And at 18, I was a newly divorced single mother, and I could not deal with that fact. I was undiagnosed with depression, anxiety, and now that I know at 31, ADHD. And so I asked my parents to take custody of my son, and I, for the next year, spiraled. I spent most of my time drowning my everything in drugs and alcohol. And it was at this time I was my most sexually active. And still there was shame, always the shame. Luckily for me, I had a nurse practitioner who gave me birth control. And so I didn't get pregnant again. But if I hadn't had access to it, if I hadn't been on Medicaid at 16, 17, and 18, I probably would have been one of the statistics. I would have gotten pregnant again. I'm very lucky that I never got an STI. But I've heard countless stories of girls and young women, and their stories match mine. The time that they were most sexually active, the time where they were partying the hardest, the time where they were doing everything and anything they could to just deal and drown, was the times that it was the worst for them in terms of their mental health and their self-esteem. And I pulled myself out of that spiral, but I didn't do it alone. I had a support system. I had friends who had also become teen mothers, who also didn't have the choice. I grew up in a very conservative Christian community where if you got pregnant, you just dealt with the consequences. There was no choice in the matter. You got pregnant as a teen, you went to the adult ed center, you had the baby, they gave you daycare, and you finished high school. We were lucky in that sense. We had that kind of support. At the age of 20, I met another man who actually helped me pull myself out of that spiral. He was about 9 years older than me. But with his help, I got custody of my son back. I don't want to say straight because I've never been straight, but I got myself back on the right track. And after I left that relationship, it was just my son and I for the next decade. At 22, I finally left my Christian faith behind me because it wasn't serving me anymore. There was always this double standard that I saw within the church, especially around young women and young men. I remember constantly being part of young adult groups, and these men would come in and they'd talk about how promiscuous they were as teenagers and young adults, and how much they partied and went about, sleeping around, and not to sex shame anybody, but there was an underlying tone to this, saying I went out and I sowed my wild oats. And when I came back to the church and came back to God, I asked God for a virtuous woman. I asked God for a virginal wife. And God gave me that wife. So the message we heard over and over and over again is the same message we hear in modern society today, especially as women, is that men are allowed to go out and do what they will. There's no stigma around it. But as a woman, as a young adult, the fact that I had a child, had been married and divorced, had been sexually active, meant that I was no longer a prime wife material. That didn't sit right with me. Why always the double standard? Why am I being told from a pulpit that women are less because men have so much power they're allowed that they can take something like our purity from us. It didn't make sense because what about their purity? It doesn't show up the same way. And so finally, after a long series of events, I decided I'm done. I'm done with the church. This is not serving my life anymore. And honestly, if I'm being completely honest, part of it was that I just wanted to stop being or feeling shamed. I wanted to stop feeling shameful about my own life choices because they were different from what I was raised with. And that was hard. That was one of the hardest things I'd ever done because my entire life was wrapped up in my church community. All of my friends were there. My entire support system was there. Even today, most of my closest friends are religious because I made them when I was religious. Most of my family are still religious, and most of them still believe that a woman does not have consent over their own body when it comes to carrying a fetus. And that's one of the hardest things for me to square. Is how do I have a relationship, a true relationship with people whose belief system is so far from my own? It's always a work in progress. So in 2020, I left the church. I left my faith and I found freedom. I found lightness. I found a hugely heavy burden that was sitting on my shoulders just kind of lifted. And it was because I wasn't being held to an impossible standard anymore. So I spent the next few years searching. Was it just Christianity that I didn't believe in, or was it anything spiritual? And I do what I expect a lot of people do. I went through and I learned about Buddhism and I learned about paganism and I looked into Wicca and I searched spirituality and I found that none of it eventually resonated with me. And so now I live in northern Indiana in a very conservative Christian community as an atheist, as a bisexual. I didn't find my own sexuality until I was about 25. And the story behind that is one of my favorites, actually. One of my very good friends that I'd worked with for years had come to me in a very tiny country bar somewhere near my hometown. And he'd come out to me that night that I met him there. And I told him, "Hon, I always knew." And he asked how. And I said, "I just saw it. It didn't matter." And a few months later, another couple that I had known in high school were at that same bar. And I turned to my best friend who was sitting with me at the time, and I said, "Their love does not seem wrong to me." And it was the first time I acknowledged the fact that out loud, that I was starting to change the views I'd grown up with. Because from the pulpit, constantly, I was being preached to that abortion, that other religions, that the LGBTQ community were all evil. That's what I've been told from the age of 8 to the age of 22. That partaking in any of those things was evil. It was sinful. It was shameful. So after I made that acknowledgement to my best friend, and after I saw that couple dancing all night long, I felt something inside me shift because it had taken about 2.5 years for me to start really pushing off the indoctrination and educating myself out of the indoctrination that I had been taught my entire life. And at the age of 25, I came out to myself. I acknowledged that I was bisexual, that I was attracted to women. And it was the first time I had actually acknowledged something about myself that I knew was completely against anything and everything my parents had ever stood for. And it was the first time that I acknowledged the fact that I could never be their golden child. I could never be the good one. I had their first grandbaby. And so no matter what, their love for him would always overshadow any disappointment in me. But I knew right then and there that the minute that I acknowledged the fact that I stray from the norm, from their norm, I could never be good enough again. At 25, I went and saw my doctor, my OB, because I had decided that I didn't want any more children, but I didn't also want to be on birth control for the rest of my life until menopause. And so I went to my OB and I talked to them and I said, I want to be sterilized. I'm 25 years old. I have a child and I'm single. My answer to that, their answer to me was no. You're 25 years old. You only have one child and you're single. I'm an adult. Why can't I be sterilized? You can't be sterilized because you're not 30. You're not married. You don't have 2 kids. So my body belongs to somebody I've never met. Preferably a man in the future that I don't know. Cool. What's my other option? An IUD. Okay. Give me the IUD. By the way, you're good at taking out in about 6 years because it's negatively affecting your sexual life. The fact that women can't make a choice for themselves, especially in this day and age, without pushback from doctors and other medical professionals in the United States of America, is one of the most heartbreaking things in my life. The fact that I'm not allowed to make a decision about my body, that decision has to be approved by my partner, who preferably is male, was angering. I was angry. I was hot. And being told this by a male practitioner made it worse. And I realized right then that throughout my entire life, I had never had control over my own body. I realized right then, from the age of 7 to the age of 25, not one time was I ever asked what I wanted to do with my body. Even those one night stands that I invited into my bed didn't ask if that's what I actually wanted. And we can say it was a different time. We can say we were young, we didn't know better. That's such bullshit. We were young, we weren't taught better. And that's part of the problem. We're not taught better. We're not taught that as individuals, that we have rights to our own bodies. You're taught that you have a right not to be hit, but when you're hit, it's your fault. You're taught that you have a right not to be verbally abused. When you don't walk away from the abuse, that's your fault. We're told we have a right to be with who we want to be, but if it's not who we want you to be with, that's your fault. I was a single mother for about a decade before I met my current partner because it was easier, honestly. It was easier to raise my son, to make moral decisions without religion, to respect the bodies of the people he was friends with, to show him that being different was fine. It was easier as a single mother to do that because every relationship I had been in before that was mostly toxic masculinity. I remember so clearly one time, my son was about 6 or 7. One of my best friends at the time had told me that he just wasn't quite boy enough because he didn't like to be outside and he didn't like to get dirty, because he didn't like to be in the garage watching people work on vehicles. And I looked at her and I said, what makes him not boy enough? What makes a boy? She didn't answer my question because, first of all, she had 3 girls. But second of all, because nothing makes a boy, nothing makes a man. Working on cars and mowing the lawn and being tough and working manual labor doesn't make a man. A man is someone who identifies as a man. A boy is someone who identifies as a boy. My son plays video games and writes novels. He plays football, but he sings in the choir. He runs track, but he lifts weights. He plays with his dogs and he shoots a bow and arrow because he thinks bow and arrows are cool and no other reason. Because he read Ranger's Apprentice too many times, probably. And if you don't know what Ranger's Apprentice is, read the series. It's an amazing series. That's the thing, is that my 14-year-old son is a boy because he presents and identifies as a boy. He's not a boy because he likes to shoot the bow and arrow. He likes to play football and he pees standing up. It's not what makes a boy. And it hit me that there was going to be most people in my life, especially in the community I was raised in, that had very specific ideas of what made a boy and what made a girl. And after that conversation, I sat my son down and I said, I don't care what you want to do with your life. I don't care what you want, how you want to dress. I don't care what you decide. I don't care if you want to sit and color pages inside. I don't care if you want to go ride go-karts outside. You are whoever you want to be. Because that was the exact opposite of the message I was raised with. I want all young people to know that they have autonomy over their body. You're allowed to say no. You're allowed to have the right to make a decision. And if you're too afraid to go to an adult or a caretaker and tell them that you need protection, that you need birth control, there is a community out here that's willing to help you. The more we're taught that sexual activity is a normal part of life, and the more that we understand that if teenagers and young adults are sexually active and stop the stigma, the better off we'll be as a society. It's education that our young people need. It's not condemnation. At 29, I started college for the first time. I got lucky. 2020 gave me the push to do something different with my life. In 2020, I got married to my partner, who is a man, a man who is not afraid to talk about his emotions, who isn't afraid to cry, who isn't afraid to open up about the hard things, a man who supports anything and everything I want to do. And so I started college. And I said to myself, I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life. I didn't really know where my passions lie. And then I took my first cultural anthropology class. And immediately I fell in love with studying different cultures, with studying different societies, with studying different points of view. And I decided that's what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted to educate myself to understand. And now I am working with Toby's fund. And I could not be more proud to help to be a voice for reproductive rights, for consent over your body, and for sexual and contraceptive education. I hope to one day go on to study social justice and human rights and be an advocate for every person whose story is somewhat like mine. And for every person whose story isn't anything like mine. There's so much we need to change, so much that still has to be done. And it feels like the fight never stops. But as long as we're here, there's no choice. We have to fight. We have to claw our way into equity. We have to claw our right to exist equally. And we've been doing this as women, as trans women, as non-binary individuals since time immemorial. And we will keep doing this as long as we have to. But just know that there are others out there, others that are coming into their own, others that are fighting, that are there anytime you need to talk or need advice or need a safe place to land. There are whole communities dedicated to making this a safer world for every individual. And we're here and we want to help. I'm now 31 years old and my son is 14 and he is one of my best friends. But I still wish I'd been given the choice I still wish some days it had been my decision. I still wish that I had autonomy over my own body because I don't. Even today, I don't. So that's probably the saddest thing of all is that as a grown adult, I cannot say what I want done to my own body without the consent of another adult, without the consent of my partner to say, yeah, we talked about this and I approve. So if you're living in Indiana, if you're living in an unsafe state, just know there are people and there are networks there to help you. And Toby's fund and the state of Illinois, where they're based, are doing everything we can to make this world safer for you, safer for us. And if you need education, if you need help, don't be afraid to reach out. That's what we're here for. Thanks for listening to my story.